to ask the question about privacy. And, from my understanding, I believe that there are some countries where it's illegal to actually ask some of these questions. France being one of them, from my understanding. So I don't know, Laura, do you want to speak to that about other jurisdictions and geographies? Is there an issue about the collection and the privacy of the data?
Yeah, happy to plug in there. So I think, from our perspective, we are a diversity and inclusion data company. So I think a lot of companies right now are operating either in the kind of known unknown vector. So they know that diversity is important, but they really have no idea how to collect the data to help them improve returns, improve performance, given that driver. But I would say a lot of companies are also in the unknown space where, they see it on the news, they can't quite make the connection between a diverse workforce and inclusive environment and that McKinsey study that tells you you'll outperform, and certainly have no idea how they would quantify and measure. And I think the issue is, it is, number one, a personal sensitive issue for a lot of people. And so there's a lot of, personal resistance. And I think the second thing is it feels very complicated. So one example is the fact that different jurisdictions have different rules in place. I think another complication is that, there are different kinds of inclusion-related issues and different kinds of bias and barriers in different regions and different cultures. But I think at the end of the day, these are all problems that can be solved if you really sit down and you figure out, look, we're going to have to get surgical, we're going to have to get customized, we're going to have to adapt our data collection techniques given the environment. It's not rocket science, luckily. So I think, one thing that we do, so we operate, many of our clients are investors, many are corporations, many have either portfolios that encompass many different regions or have offices in different countries. At the end of the day, understand the local law. So there actually are very few regions that expressly prohibit the collection of demographic data if it is for an affirmative purpose. Adapt your data collection methods appropriately. And ultimately, like any kind of investment opportunity, you're never going to have perfect data, but you will certainly have an advantage. So at the end of the day, one of our clients has investments across 23 countries. We are able to give them basically perfect gender data. I would say 70 to 80% ethnic and racial data, and then kind of the rest of the categories, not quite as close. We are able to give them sentiment, experience, inclusion, risk of harassment, risk of scandal across all of their regions, all of their companies. And at the end of the day, this client is in a much better position than they would be if they didn't do anything. Oh, just to quickly build on Elena's point, I think it's so important. The experience we often see in large companies like Refinitiv is, look, at the start of your journey, you're going to need to build that trust with your employees. So the first time you run the survey, there will be employees who are a little reluctant, a little bit nervous, might be shy that the information might be used against them. What we see very commonly is if you take the approach that I'm sure Refinitiv is taking, where you collect the data for a positive purpose and then you act on it, you do something with the information that the employees experience as improving their experience. The next time you run the survey and try to collect the data, you're going to see your response rates go way up. And we see that very commonly with large organizations. Typically, the first time that we run a survey to collect the data, response rates may be 60 to 70%. 6 to 12 months later, after they've implemented some programs that expressly respond to the feedback of employees, often we see response rates get up to 90%. And that's really quite unheard of for an engagement survey.
Which leads us actually really interesting into the next poll questions, which are, the first one being, given the challenges of collecting this data beyond gender, how comfortable are you in sharing the information on race or ethnic origin to help your organization collect diversity data? It's coming in at 69% that are saying that they are highly comfortable. So Laura, very much in line with what you're suggesting here is that I think, in general, there's only 3% here that are suggesting that they're not comfortable at all. So there is there's an element of trust, obviously, I think that comes into this. And then we asked this question, the other question I'll just highlight before we get reactions is what are the major concerns that you perceive in sharing such information? And the number one concern here is privacy. And the second being, fear of discrimination. So those really are the two big issues. So Laura, maybe I'll come back to you. About measuring, how do we get to this point? Hasina mentioned that there are challenges that our investors are facing at getting the right information or getting information. We often hear that it's difficult to get it and that this relates to these privacy issues. So how can companies collect reliable, accurate data to be able then to provide out to the market?
Yeah, so I think the simplest answer from our perspective is we are, our kind of core tool is a survey that we then apply artificial intelligence to generate recommendations. But, in the simplest form, we find that if we go and work with a company as a third party that has implemented multiple levels of controls to ensure that employees remain anonymous and that the data is not traceable to any specific individual, we find that reassurance really helps build that trust and kind of overcome that concern. I think the second thing is there is a lot of data, and we're kind of at the cutting edge of this right now, working with a few universities. There's a lot of data that you can collect based on feedback that's given by employees that is not associated with their demographic characteristics. So I'm thinking specifically about inclusion and really those risk factors and return factors that are associated with having a highly diverse and inclusive workplace. Lower risk, less volatility because there's less risk of a harassment scandal, for example. Better returns because a more productive and engaged workforce. And so what we're starting to do more of is analyzing free text data from employees, analyzing workplace reviews, analyzing social media, and really applying natural language processing to start to quantify what are those inclusion-related factors that are affecting your workplace without, again, relying on employees to disclose their kind of personal identity.
That's very interesting, the two worlds coming together here. I kind of switch gears here a little bit, but I want to just look at our last polling question before I do that. And Laura comes back to your response about how we might be able to do this. So our question was, what would be the best way to incentivize employees to share their D&I information? And it's quite interesting. I find the top rated one here is an anonymous employee survey, as you mentioned, but 36% is also speaking to the transparency on the results. Let's shift this conversation a little bit into inclusion. And how do you assess how would an investor start to look at inclusion? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think, Mila, that's a really important question that we tackled early on. Is we said, look, a lot of companies and investors perceive inclusion to be a fluffy, amorphous concept. How do you really quantify that? How do you possibly benchmark that? What are the key drivers or KPIs that are beneath the surface? And so what we did early on is we created a universal, basically scorecard that traces back to 6 overall metrics that drive or reflect a highly inclusive organization. And I think most importantly, all have a link to business performance. So one of the metrics, for example, is a safe work environment. And the performance driver there is a safer workplace means lower risk of some sort of event or scandal or lawsuit. And ultimately, what we've done to create a standardized data collection basically system is we've deployed that scorecard now across about 36 countries, collected data in different languages from different kinds of employees. And I think where it gets interesting is, many of our investor clients are in the venture capital space, for example. And what they're really finding is that inclusion score becomes a key risk factor that they look at when they're holding their companies accountable at board meetings. And increasingly, what's quite interesting is they're now incorporating that into their diligence processes. So as one example, we have basically an AI tool that quantifies or predicts if a company is at risk of a scandal related to diversity and inclusion using social media data. And so several of our clients will basically run that scan before deciding to invest in a company. And if they see that the company has been at risk in the past of a scandal, they really think twice. Because I think for me, the game changer, throughout this pandemic, but, going back to, even Me Too, it really is social media. And at the end of the day, McKinsey has been saying, and Deloitte has been saying, and BCG has been saying for years, diversity drives performance. In our experience, what has really moved the needle for investors is, look, if you are invested heavily in a company that has a scandal, we know that the market cap, the market value of that company will typically drop about 3.1% within 3 days of that scandal breaking, 7% over the long term. And then at the extreme end, the company goes bankrupt because investors pull out, customers, refuse to buy, so on and so forth. And it's really that kind of immediate impact that quantifying, measuring, and incorporating inclusion into investment decisions can help you avoid. Mila, do you mind if I maybe jump in here? So, Christina, I think because the two challenges that you've outlined, we hear very consistently. So I think number one is, how do we measure outcomes rather than efforts? Because quite frankly, if you give companies a checklist, everyone's going to check every box. And how do you know that, that's translating into an outcome? And I think, number two, I love the push around engagement surveys. And at the end of the day, if you have a company full of, white men who are very happy because they're surrounded by white men, you're going to get an A+ on your engagement survey. So I think the two ways that kind of we approach it that might be just interesting as a case study. Number one, if you're analyzing big data sets, of course, if you have internal data from employees, that's a great indicator of outcomes. So what's their experience? How included do they feel? But even if you don't, there's a lot that you can do with online public social media data. So for example, we have NLP technology that analyzes online employee reviews. And so a great way to kind of hold the company accountable is say, look, you say you've implemented an anti-harassment policy. We ran this NLP on Glassdoor and Indeed, and we found that the kind of response rate around the harassment pain point was 40%. So, reconcile that for me. So I think that's kind of one opportunity. I think the second, and this kind of feels simplistic to us because we've maybe been doing it for a while, but the scorecard that we produce for companies and for investors really breaks down employee engagement data by demographic group. And so we have our 6 inclusion metrics, including things like, do you feel safe in the workplace? Do you feel like your opinion is sought out and valued by your teams? We break that down by the dominant group and then the non-dominant groups. So you can see quite clearly, like, look, the dominant group might be 10 out of 10 on safe work, but women are 6 out of 10, ethnic and racial minorities are 4 out of 10, folks in the LGBT community are, 5.5 out of 10. And it's really looking at those differences that tells you, look, is there some sort of systemic bias happening within the organization? And at that point, you're not kind of overwhelming the voice of the minority groups through the average because you're really disaggregating the data.
So there's and I will welcome the audience to continue to provide us with your questions. There's a few coming in here. So there's a one here right now that's asking, how can investors analyze inclusive culture? What are the KPIs for good corporate culture?
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned, so we've got a scorecard. So basically 6 metrics with a clear business relationship to diversity and inclusion. And what we've started, because I think there's question 1, which is what do we measure? And then question 2, what is the data that supports that measurement? So in question 1, the metrics are, and I'm happy to share them with anyone kind of after the call, inclusive culture, bias and feedback, flexible work options, safe work environment, which is code for harassment, mentorship and sponsorship, and then recruiting and hiring. And the way that we collect that data, often it's through an employee pulse survey, again, completely anonymous. But where I think it gets interesting is we're getting more and more of that insight through free text feedback from employees. And so what we did, actually working with the University of Waterloo and Dalhousie University out east, is we created an NLP algorithm that identifies really specific pain points or strengths in support of those 6 metrics. And so to Hasina's point, you get the red flag signals, what's going wrong, but you also get signals about what the strengths of that company might be. So under inclusive culture, for example, you might have that empathy building and employee engagement, kind of the sub-metrics, are really strong in a particular company. And so that's something that they should be celebrated for. And in fact, they should celebrate because it will help them attract better talent. But at the same time, under your safe work environment score, you might have an issue with retaliation from employees that say they've reported harassment and it didn't go well. If that comes out in the red, that's something that you need to raise with the company or maybe factor into your decision.
So it's interesting for us in our practice, when we're working with issuers, we're always talking about culture being a board issue. That, this is not just a management issue. This really sits at the board level. So I'd like to kind of change our conversation here a little bit about the board's responsibility when we're speaking about diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, maybe just building on Hasina, because I think your experience is reflected in a study that was just published looking at the most recent proxy voting season. And the trend I thought was so interesting is the percentage of companies basically that elevated HR issues, in particular relating to diversity and inclusion, to the board's mandate rose from, I think, 20% to 68%. And so I think what you put so well is diversity within the boardroom has been on the agenda for decades. So I think there's a clear awareness that you need diverse people at the boardroom table while you're debating. But on the flip side, it's also now within the responsibility and the purview of the board to look at diversity and inclusion within the company, to your point, that they are mandated to oversee. And I think the idea here is, I think Black Lives Matter really, and I know I've said this before, but really clarified and emphasized what a critical risk factor the failure to take action on these topics can be. And that's being reflected in the job of the board, which has to be focused on the top priorities for the company.
So I'd like to take a few minutes and go to some of the questions. We have been kind of inadvertently answering some of the questions that are coming up from the audience. But there's one here that I'd like to hit off the top, which are, what are some examples of the best programs that are launched by companies after collecting self-identifying data, so that companies garner trust of the employees? Anybody have any thoughts there?
I can give one example, and I think clearly to that bucket of the unknown unknowns. So we worked with one of our earliest clients was in the healthcare space in I'm going to say a state in the West, in the USA. And they came to us because they were, quite sure that there was sexual harassment going on. It was kind of right after Me Too, and they were really worried that, that women felt excluded. When we went in and assessed the company, we found that, especially relative to their sector, women felt pretty good. And it's probably them being worried was probably a reflection of they were building a culture that was supportive of women. They had a massive problem in the LGBT community. And so their scores, when you disaggregated that scorecard and you looked at that particular community, it was kind of ones and twos across the board. And when you looked at the free text feedback, there were, reports of harassment, stereotypical language, exclusion at networking events, et cetera. And so what the company did that ended up actually really accelerating their scores from that group in particular was, number one, Elena, to your point, really set the tone from the top. And so the executive team celebrated Pride Month for the first time. They had never acknowledged it before. But the executive team personally went out to employees, joined the resource group meeting, sent a note to the employee base expressing their support. And that one small step, honestly, we saw it in the free text the next time we ran the survey. Employees really appreciated that. And I think secondly is they then deployed basically a kind of training and coaching module with their employees that was really specific and targeted at the types of bias that was being faced by them, given their data. So it wasn't kind of that 90-minute super boring harassment video that you have to sit through. It was really a training designed with their culture in mind. And so what we saw kind of when we reran the diagnostic is not only did the LGBT scores grow, but other employees felt more included because they said, look, if we're, I'm a person with a disability, and I know that my company is looking for challenges, I now feel like we have a culture where I can come forward and say, like, I'm actually not feeling included, and I've seen that you will act on it. So those are just two quick examples.
So maybe we're just coming up to the very end of our session today. So I'd like to, there's one question that's very au courant, which is, COVID-19 has brought unprecedented uncertainty and stress to our lives, and mental health has become a prominent issue for many organizations. Is there a relationship between D&I metrics and mental health? And if so, how are investors to evaluate it?
Yeah. I'm happy.
Laura, you look like you'd like to answer that.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So I think absolutely. So when we track diversity and inclusion, one of the types of diversity that we look at includes people who have mental health challenges. And so we absolutely see, number one, that number has grown with the onset of the pandemic. But number two, companies that have put in place, really strong policies and programs to support mental health are well positioned throughout the pandemic. One example being those who already had remote work policies in place and kind of tactics to train and coach and support employees have seen that those mental health numbers have, stayed pretty steady. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing I got to give a big shout out to Dalhousie University. They reached out to us a few months ago, and they're starting a really big research effort, looking at social media data to really get to the crux of, what specific mental health challenges have really surfaced throughout the pandemic, and what companies have kind of gotten them right. And so we're quite hopeful that the results of that study will help us create really, systemic recommendations, especially looking ahead to a second wave and really set companies up to succeed.